Ready to roll. We are still trying to debate what the point of this panel is, and we haven't yet reached a conclusion. Maybe by the end of the session, it'll become apparent. I think what motivated the creation of the panel was this strange juxtaposition of two facts. The first is that the fraction of people's lives that are devoted to internet-related things has gone from 0 to probably 20–25% in one generation. So regardless of how one measures the significance of an industry with regard to sales or profits or employment or whatever, this has become extremely important to a lot of people who derive enormous amounts of personal satisfaction from the fact that they're interconnected. Yet at the same time, the publicity associated with the industry has become increasingly strident and negative, with these large and particular platform companies being blamed for a significant fraction of what is perceived to be going wrong in society. So what's really is this all about? And so there are both sublime and ridiculous explanations for why this is true. And I will start off with the ridiculous and get to the more serious. Certainly at the more ridiculous end of the spectrum, it's what we observe as sort of pointless tweaks against the industry, like denying the right of companies to give their employees lunch, trying to prevent companies from providing free bus service for their employees. What behind all that, I would say, is the latest sequel to that incredibly profound movie, Revenge of the Nerds. That this is partly about the fact that the people involved in this industry are different. They are what I would say the classic deliverance of the Enlightenment period, of the living your life, not just your laboratory as the scientific method, where you think of the world as a problem to be solved. You approach it by having a conceptual model of how it works. You collect information, you test hypotheses, and as time goes on, whatever it is you're doing keeps getting better and better and better. And that certainly is the classical characterization of what's happened in the information technology sector over the last 40 years. We've partly driven by physical science and engineering, which has first made memory essentially free and is now making computational power essentially free, making it possible to do things with big data and artificial intelligence that were not even conceivable as recently as 15, 20 years ago. And the people who are doing this are the people we used to call nerds. I was proud to be a nerd when I was in high school, and I was proud to be a nerd when I was in college, but believe me, there weren't very many of us. And now I get a tear in my eye when I see that the most popular t-shirt at Stanford is one with a Stanford logo, and above that, Nerd Nation. We have a whole university now where everybody perceives themselves, even the English majors, as nerds. That is really cool, all right? And I'm glad we finally won. But part of it is just that. It's differences. But there's a second point, which I think is extremely important, which is judging on the basis of market capitalization. The handful of the biggest internet-based companies, platform companies, are the largest corporations in history, by far. All right? An incredible amount of capitalized wealth represented in the shares of these handful of companies. They are not the biggest companies by any other measure. They're not the biggest companies measured by profits. They're not the biggest companies measured by gross revenues. They're not the biggest companies, not even close to the biggest companies, measured by number of employees, and that's because of the first effect. the average compensation of people in these companies is really high compared to most of the other very large companies we've observed past in history. So they're extremely important, but they're important in a new and unique and difficult to understand way. And it certainly looks to an ordinary person like this huge market capitalization and the creation of 20-something billionaires by the boatload. There's something funny about this. There must be something weird going on here. Okay, now let's get to more serious about what that something weird might be. And the something weird really is the realization of a very old idea that economists came up with 50 years ago. It was sort of one of the very first insights from when economists started doing game theory and taking it seriously, which is the concept of information rents. That is to say, if there's a huge asymmetry in the amount of information that is possessed among people who interact with each other in any kind of social circumstance, whether it's a market or anything else, there's a huge advantage to being the one with more information. It's not just markets, of course. It's also playing Monopoly or anything, or playing poker. There's a big advantage that goes to the person with the superior information, who has the most data, the most sophisticated ways of analyzing that data, the most reliable ways to predict the future on the basis of those data. What the information technology revolution has done is gradually over time increase the information rents. And people perceive that, all right? They perceive that there's an advantage to be gained, an increasing advantage, that Amazon has an advantage that Sears never had, all right? And that Microsoft and Apple have an advantage that IBM never had. And that concern, despite all the good things happening from the use of the information technology and the internet, is a substantive fact of life about information technology, a redistributive effect that may not even come close to offsetting the efficiency benefit and the benefits of technological progress, but it is a reality, a redistributional effect from the technology. Now, this manifests itself then in several of the issues that we see, some of which have been debated thus far and some of which haven't. The two that we're going to focus on are the privacy issue and the message mediation issue. By privacy, of course, I refer to the fact that a specific individual may find someone capturing the use of capturing their data, creating algorithms to make use of that data that enable this information rent capture, all right, that enable somebody else to get the economic benefit of my personal life history. The message mediation issue is the sort of public good aspect of the same problem, which is that people who are in possession of both the data and the mechanisms for manipulating them can take advantage of the information rents and the behavioral features of human beings that they will not necessarily behave rationally in response to some information, and cause not only that person's behavior to change, but cause enough people's behavior to change that it has spillover effects that damage the entire society. All right? Those are the two main issues that we can actually focus on and say, these are at least potentially interesting and important issues to be described. And then the last point is, okay, now that if we've identified what may or may not be the problem, we'll see how big it is and try to get our hands around it to define it in a more precise way. But then what are the policy tools? And the policy tools are, we can have traditional liability law. We can sue people if they do things to us or to society. We can have a regulatory intervention. We can have a different way to define property rights, such as who owns the actual data and what is the mechanism for transferring control of that data. Or we can use antitrust. We can say these things are monopolies. They've acquired their position in some sort of a way that makes them vulnerable to antitrust attack. So the question then is, do the traditional ways, things we've inherited in these four policy domains, actually work in this modern world? And there are lots of people out there who say, no, they don't work. We have to rethink the entire American business legal system in order to cope with the new challenges created by information technology. Okay, that is the place where we start our discussion. The panelists, I'm not going to go through elaborate introductions because you have the definitions here. This sort of looks ivory tower-ish up here, except for Wilson, but it really isn't. It's only two are really true, unmitigated ivory towers. Shane Greenstein from the Harvard Business School, who occasionally has dabbled in advising the government, but he's basically a pure academic. Bob Hahn, again, similar story. He did little minor things like be the economist who wrote the Clean Air Act of 1990. But aside from that, he spent most of his time as a research economist spent a long time at the AEI Brookings Joint Center on Regulation. So here are the two ivory-towered eggheads. Now next we have Daphne Keller, who sort of looks like an ivory tower. She's a Stanford law professor, but what happened really was that she's a refugee from Google, and she was granted asylum on the Stanford campus. And she is now part of our Internet and Society program and is focusing on digital law issues. And then, of course, we have Steve Tadelis, who, he started off life as an economic theorist, and then somehow he was kidnapped, first by eBay and then Amazon. But he recently escaped, and he's now back safely in academia after being a vice president at Amazon and a senior economist at eBay. And finally, we have our genuine business person, Wilson White, who is with Google and is responsible for public policy issues associated with a large fraction of what Google does, including Android, its hardware, and various other things, and pay systems. So this is our panel. I'm going to start off at the end with Wilson and say, okay, given this framework, what are we going to do about the privacy issue? What is the nature of the problem? How severe is it? And what do we do about it?
Good question. Thank you all for having me. This is my first time attending the TPI conference, so as a neophyte, I'm happy to be the only true industry player on a panel with this topic. Let me start just by offering somewhat of a rebuttal to some of the comments from the previous talk. It is true that there's a lot of negative publicity right now around internet platforms and what the internet means in terms of privacy, but I do want to offer at least some data points on how the internet has been beneficial to us, right? The latest numbers that I've seen are 2016 numbers, but in 2016, 6% of the US GDP was attributed to the internet industries. That equates to like $1.2 trillion. Over 10.4 million jobs were created from the internet economy across all 50 states, and 86% of those jobs were outside of the major tech hubs, outside of Silicon Valley and Austin and Boston, right? So the internet economy has really been hugely beneficial. It's been an engine to economic growth, and that's why I echo the sentiment that our CEO at Google says pretty frequently, which is that I remain a technology optimist, and not because I believe so strongly in technology, but because I believe in people. And people will continue to leverage technology and these advances to not only protect our values in terms of privacy, but also to ensure that we're maximizing and getting the best benefit from what this technology has to offer. So the negative publicity, I think, is an area where I think Julie Brill mentioned this in her panel this morning, that we're in the midst of a paradigm shift. I mean, we really are. Some people have called this the second machine age or the age of artificial intelligence. But whatever you call it, it's certainly true that recent advances in machine learning and computing power, it's ushering in a new wave of innovative potential. And whenever you have this kind of new wave of potential, there's certainly new questions and new risks that we as a society have to wrestle with. And we have to figure out where on that kind of what's the equilibrium, what are we comfortable with, what's the trade-offs. And for me, some of the benefits that I think this technology has brought are both on the individual side as well as the societal side. For example, on the individual side, I can use my navigation app, Google Maps. If you haven't used it, you should. It's a pretty good navigation app. But with that navigation app, I can know the approximate time it's going to take me to get from destination A to from my start point to my destination. That's not possible without me having some quid pro quo in terms of information I'm willing to give this service in order to get that benefit. It's a huge benefit for me. Someone else may not want to have that benefit. That may not be an important feature for them, and they can opt not to give that information because it's not a useful benefit for them. So it's kind of on the individual scale. I spent some time in Japan earlier this summer at an AI conference, meeting with business leaders and NGOs and government leaders, thinking about the implications of AI on society. And one of the issues that Japan is facing is an aging population and negative population growth. And so the idea of leveraging AI and technology to increase productivity, it's a real thing for that economy. And that's a benefit that's more of a kind of collective benefit. Now, of course, with these benefits, there are also drawbacks. And I think one of the things that we're seeing that's fueling some of the negative publicity are kind of quintessential things, right? Like bad actors, right? People who are finding ways to abuse the platforms or to violate policies that are in place. And these aren't necessarily new things. Like we've been dealing with things like spam and malware for a number of years. These things are taking on kind of a new face as the technology improves, as the ability for bad actors to do bad things continues to evolve. So it's kind of a evolution of a very familiar thing, which is how do we stay on the forefront of people who are intent on doing bad things with the platforms. But for me, the thing that's most exciting and the thing that I think we have to keep in context as we strike this balance between data and privacy and what we're willing to trade in order to get these benefits are the huge potential to solve big challenges that have vexed us as a society for a very long time. Things like healthcare and healthcare delivery. If you live in an area like Silicon Valley, dealing with things like traffic and urban planning, energy, climate, these are big challenges that technology has the potential to help us finally solve. And that will involve data, and it will involve collective decisions on our part on what data are we willing to give up, what protections should be in place so that we're extracting those benefits but not compromising our values around privacy. And that's the question that I think collectively we have to wrestle with. Now at Google, I think we see the writing on the wall. There with GDPR, with what's happening in Asia and Brazil, there is this newfound effort to define some frameworks for how we deal with data privacy. And we support that general trend. I'll flag a few things that I think we should keep in mind as this trend continues to evolve. The first is that in almost every country, there is some law that governs data privacy that's already existing. So one of the things I think would behoove us as a collective society is to make sure that we are doing a thorough diligence on what already exists so that we can be smart about where those gaps may be and ensure that we're putting our efforts toward closing those gaps. The second thing that I'll flag that's very important for us as a platform provider here is privacy means different things to different people in different contexts. And I think we've heard that from others on other panels. But what that means is that it's a non-trivial problem to try to fix privacy, right? When you have such a dynamic view of what it means, how it should be applied, and what actually works. And so one of the things that we think should be paramount in whatever efforts that we as a society take in this effort is to ensure that we're putting users in control, that we're giving users choice and transparency and control. Because if the user has that level of control, then these kind of differences in culture and legal regimes are somewhat easier to navigate. So those are kind of the guiding principles that I think we can get behind and that we support in terms of coming up with a baseline approach to how we address data privacy issues.
One of the specific things in the GDPR is an emphasis on the ease of changing the definition of who owns and controls information about an individual, which has part of it is the simplicity argument, which is that for going beyond what the default option is, opt-in or opt-out, it should be as easy to restrict the use of my data as it is to grant the use of my data, and then ending in the right to be forgotten. What is your view about how that could ever be actually enforced and implemented?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it's one I think conceptually, if you ask someone that without context, almost everyone will agree with that. That as a user, you should be able to control your data, gate when it's collected, how it's used, have 100% control on that. But in practice, if that creates huge amount of friction in terms of your ability to get the benefit from that, users may have a different take on that question. And I think that's the balance that we as a society have to strike. We have to not just use the concept, but actually give users a clear idea of what that looks like in practice, right? If I, as a user, I have to give permission for every single piece of data that's collected, tell you exactly how you can use that data, and then have the ability to extract that data on demand at any time, what does that actually mean in terms of the benefits that I've come to love and that I want more of? And what does it mean in terms of solving new problems that we have yet to tackle? And as we go through this kind of collective process of figuring out what the baseline regime should be, that's the framing that I think we should use.
Would any of you like to respond to Wilson before I get on to the next question? Steve?
I want to say just a couple of words. Thanks for that, Wilson. And, you know, as an economist, it's hard for me not to use quote unquote revealed preference as a guiding principle, right? And we heard in one of the morning panels when Leslie John talked about how easy people just release their information. You know, I consider myself a relatively educated, relatively sophisticated decision maker.
We'll be the judge of that.
I consider myself. But, you know, I freely give away a lot of my private information, and I think it's really hard to take a stance that people are generally and genuinely stupid, they don't know what's good for them, and actually someone else knows what's better for them. And I think that's a very slippery slope, in particular because the costs and benefits of privacy and of the data that's being generated are diverse and not always easy to measure. So for example, if I think about the benefit side, the more I use a website, be it Google, be it Amazon, be it eBay, be it Facebook, the more the website could learn about things I like and things I don't like, therefore reducing my costs of friction for search, giving me ways to broaden my horizons, both in terms of exploitative searches, of things that are similar to what I've searched before, or maybe exploratory things that given other people or given people like me that they explore and they get benefits from it. At the same time, yes, there is a cost of maybe I'm going to have some data that could be embarrassing or that could lead to identity theft. And how do we put the right numbers on measuring that cost? Just as a completely left field comparison, take mountain climbing, which I don't do. But a quick Google search tells me that roughly 145 people out of 1 million die a year from mountain climbing. Is that a high number? Doesn't sound like a high number. And now I wonder if I go to San Francisco, which has about 1 million people living in it, do 145 people a year suffer from identity theft? Is it 10 times that? Is it a tenth of that? How do we quantify the cost of identity theft compared to someone dying from mountain climbing? And people are willingly engaging in mountain climbing. So I think it's really important to find ways to quantify these things to better understand the costs and benefits of this proliferation of data and possible issues of privacy.
And not to mention like our responsibility in terms of data security, as
Of course.
not just platform providers, but everyone in the ecosystem, right? App developers, publishers, anyone who's collecting and using users' data, it's incumbent upon you to protect the security of that data. Charles Rifkin mentioned the Sony hack earlier, and if you all recall that incident, I lived it. personally, but what was behind that hack was this movie called The Interview, which was critical of the leader of North Korea. And so all the theaters, citing security concerns, decided not to show the movie. And at Google, we got a call from Sony to say, hey, look, we really want to get this movie out. And Google was the first platform to actually play the movie digitally, because we're very confident in our security and that it wouldn't be hacked. And so platforms and others who are collecting data, they have an obligation, I think, to invest heavily in ensuring that when you get this data, that you're going to do right by the users and protect the security of the data.
Bob, you wanted to say something about privacy.
A couple things. One is, I'm not sure I completely buy the revealed preference argument. There was a calculation that a student did at Carnegie Mellon several years ago, asking the question, if you calculated the value of time of looking at the privacy statements on websites, what would that look like in the United States? And I think they came up with a number like $700 or $800 billion per year. And I don't even think that included things like cell phones. I was convinced by this morning's panel that we don't know a heck of a lot about what people are willing to pay or willing to accept for privacy. I'm also convinced, related to some of the points that you made, that we live in an era of what I would call pretend property rights. Everybody's willing to click through, or most people are willing to click through on those apps without having any clue what they're giving up. So it strikes me as a non-lawyer, and I'm sure there are problems with this, is we ought to get rid of that, get rid of these I do or I accept statements, or simplify them in a way that makes sense for the consumer. And I don't know what the best way to do that, but it strikes me that one of the things that's absent here is any expression of what Google or Facebook might be willing to pay you, or conversely, what you might be willing to pay them for the privilege of using that. So you might want to have some sort of simple statement like, instead of the 13 paragraphs, you might want to have some statement like, Facebook agrees to pay you 5 cents for some sort of activity in exchange for letting you use the website or whatever, and they're going to use the information in the following ways, and they're going to share it with third parties in the following ways, without that being more than, say, a page or something like that. So I just throw that out as an option to try to think through how we might get a price on what people are willing to pay or accept to use these websites or applications.
I think this feeds next immediately into the message mediation issue, which is the premise of which is, this is the tension between Bob and Steve. The premise of it is that when people are not fully informed, they can be manipulated by the appropriate way that information is is partially revealed and partially not revealed to them. And so this is Daphne's one of her major concerns. And so the questions that I have for Daphne are, what is the nature of this misinformation and disinformation problem on social media platforms that makes it differ from the other ways that information has been conveyed to individuals in the past? And as a technical matter, can this problem actually be solved? Or is it one that we're just going to have to live with as long as we have something like the internet?
So I've been on a lot of panels in the last year or two about misinformation and disinformation and social media. And I've heard a lot of a sentiment that I think speaks to your question, which is, we want Walter Cronkite back. We want a world of 3 networks with standards and somebody we trust. And that's understandable, right? We've all had a kind of scary couple of years. There's a lot of bad stuff out there. It's discouraging, the kinds of disinformation, mob brutality, fake news. There's a lot of garbage on the internet, and some of it is dangerous. And so Walter Cronkite sounds kind of reassuring. On the other hand, in the era of 3 network broadcasts, there were a lot of voices we didn't hear from. We didn't hear from a lot of African American people in the South. We didn't hear from a lot of LGBT people. And I think most of us here are old enough to remember how miraculous it was when the internet came along and suddenly you could hear from those people and everyone could talk. I think for a while culturally, certainly in the era of John Perry Barlow, a lot of people were really entranced by the utopian possibility of that. And now we've swung to the opposite extreme, seeing all the terrible things that humans can do with speech. And it's hard to sort out what to do. So the bad stuff online, one problem with it, or one thing that makes it harder to know what to do with it, is a little bit of it's illegal. Like a little bit of it is copyright piracy, or it's child pornography, like it's bad stuff. And there are laws requiring platforms to take it down. Some of it is illegal, like it's defamation, and there aren't laws requiring platforms to take it down. And then a huge swath of it is not illegal and couldn't be illegal under the First Amendment. So a lot of the things we call fake news, Holocaust denial, anorexia, how-to videos, all this really ugly stuff is not actually illegal speech. And so when we ask, what can be done about the bad stuff online, we're asking what can be done about a bunch of speech that is actually legal. So I think it's not surprising that when people look for a way to fix the problem, whatever we think the problem is, platforms seem like the answer, right? They have the capacity to do things that nobody else can do in response to speech that's going on, hosted on their servers. They also are making money off of those services. So a lot of people think it seems just to ask them to do the cleanup. And so we've seen a lot of push over a period of several years, particularly in Europe, for platforms to take down more and more content. One result of that is the EU hate speech code of conduct, which Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, and YouTube signed on to a year or two ago, that commits that they'll take EU hate speech law, which prohibits a whole lot more speech than US law does, and put it in their terms of service so it applies to everyone around the world. So there's more and more coming down. There's more and more of a push for platforms to take responsibility for that. And recently, we've started to get to the obvious and inevitable downside of that, which is they're taking down too much. Now we have people who are very angry across the political spectrum, by the way. It's been getting attention from conservatives recently, but lots of people are angry that their speech gets taken down. And many of them have really sympathetic stories. I was on Canadian public radio recently with a woman, African-American woman, who a stranger yelled racial epithets at her children in a grocery store. She took to Facebook to tell her friends about it and seek support. And because she used the word that this asshole in the grocery store had used, she had her post taken down and her account locked. And not only could she not get on Facebook to commiserate with her friends, she was also suddenly locked out of all of these other services because she had used Facebook as her logon ID. So there's a very human downside to the over-removal consequence that comes from this push. We also know very clearly that when platforms have incentives to take down content, such as facing legal liability, they err on the side of caution and take down too much. That's right, not surprising in a room full of economists. We have a lot of data on this from the copyright context, only because that's where the transparent data is. But we can anticipate that anywhere where a platform will be publicly punished, fined, facing a bad press cycle, facing potential new regulation for not taking things down, the incentive is to continue with this problem of taking down too much. So what do we want? We want them to take down neither too much nor too little. We want this Goldilocks spot. And that doesn't really exist, right? Like if what we want them to do is take down illegal speech, then we accept all the Holocaust denial. We accept all of this stuff that is upsetting, is harmful, drives users away from platforms, drives advertisers away from platforms. That seems like a direction most people don't like. If we say we want platforms to be responsible for crafting a moral code that's going to satisfy all of us and enforce that, Well, and platforms are increasingly embracing like that, right? The Mark Zuckerberg quote that our predecessor offered. But the problem is, of course, we're never going to agree on what should come down. And for a lot of reasons, whatever the rules are, platforms are likely to fail. They will take down too much. Mostly they'll take down too much. We know that human moderators often take down too much. We know that technical filters make really grievous errors, like the filter that took down over 100,000 videos documenting human rights abuses in Syria off of YouTube, and the Syrian Archive, which is a human rights organization that maintains them, has no idea if they'll ever be able to get them back or if there are duplicates out there somewhere. So we can expect a lot of problems with this moral code approach. But the bigger problem, I think, and maybe I'm being like the free speech person in the room, but I'll take that role, is we're asking platforms to police us. Like, we go to Twitter and to Facebook and to our instant message apps and et cetera to do things that would have once been a whisper in our sweetheart's ear, or to remind our husband to pick up milk, or to send a baby picture to grandma. All of those things, that is our normal day-to-day speech now. And when we ask platforms to come in and enforce a moral code, it's not a moral code against those other people out there. It is a code against the fundamental communications platform of our age and something that we all rely on. So I have a lot of wariness about that. Okay, I'm going to step away from that and talk a little bit about regulatory models. And this is kind of fun for me because this is like awkward topics I would never get to raise if I were still at Google. Like, what would regulating a platform for speech purposes look like? I think there's this false dichotomy that gets shopped around, like, oh, they should take the same responsibilities as media. They should be like broadcast or like a newspaper, which would make sense if the platforms were creating and disseminating their own content at the scale that a newspaper once did. But for all of our speech all the time, constantly, it's beyond difficult. It is, I think, a very bad idea because, again, it is our speech. The other side of the dichotomy, people say, well, no, actually platforms say this, actually we're like telephone companies. We should be regulated like, we should have no responsibility because we are telephone companies. The danger there is implying perhaps you should be regulated but like a telephone company and given common carriage obligations. So it's neither of those comparisons really make sense, right? That's not how they function. They're not like a broadcaster. They're not like telephone companies. What are some narrower options? And I think this kind of tracks Roger's points at the beginning. Well, a lot of people ask for process fixes. If we can't get the perfect moral code for online speech, we should at least have a lot of transparency and clarity about what the rules are. People whose speech gets taken down should know why. They should have an opportunity to appeal. That's, I think, kind of low-hanging fruit, and there's a lot of pressure for that, including legal pressure under European consumer protection law. And I think platforms are trying to move toward that, big ones at least, as best they can now. But that doesn't solve the problem of what are the right rules. Another approach to it is a lot of people say, well, we wouldn't care what rules these platforms were enforcing if there were a bunch of them. The problem is that there are a couple of huge ones, and if you're not there sharing your speech, you might as well not be talking at all. There's nobody there to listen. So this is a competition problem, and we need to find competition remedies to somehow break this up into alternate controllers with alternate speech rules. A third approach, which Mr. Rifkin mentioned, is to take away the immunities that platforms have for things like defamation under CDA 230. That's a good solution if your goal is to get rid of more speech. They would definitely take down a whole lot more speech. But if you want to keep legal speech online, it's not a very good solution because it would drive a whole lot more of these overreaching takedowns that we're worried about. Then there's whatever it is that Diamond and Silk want. And it seems like what they want is a fairness requirement, right? Like if you hear from Democrats, you should also hear from Republicans and like maybe monarchists and socialists. And I don't know what fairness would mean. But we've seen that before, right? We've seen that in the broadcast context. The FCC administered a whole lot of rules like this in the past. And I think a lot of people here have criticisms of how those worked out and might see problems in applying them to platforms with so many different channels of communication, and again, which are providing the basis for our daily conversation with our political speech, our family speech, everything else. And I only had 4, but then Roger, you mentioned privacy. So I'll try this other one, but I don't understand it. But I keep hearing about it. So Jack Balkin at Yale Law School has this information fiduciaries concept that like once the platform has your personal data in hand, it has a duty to treat you right? Not to abuse you with your personal data. And I understand that as a way of getting at privacy regulation. But I think some people think there's a possibility of like, well, the quid pro quo was I gave you my data, and in exchange, you're going to enforce good speech rules. And I don't know how you get there, but I'm listing it because I know it's out there. And that's every model I've heard. So I would be very curious from the rest of you, from the audience, if you know of others. And if not, let's kick the tires on those 5, because I think most of them don't really work.
Okay, next on the agenda is one of the solution proposals, which is that this is really about competition policy, that the major platforms are so influential because they have too much market power and they're too big, and the remedy is antitrust. Shane, does this, do we need a complete rethinking of antitrust policy to take into account the platforms, or is antitrust even a relevant solution?
You know, Roger, as your former student, I didn't know whether to be insulted or to take it as a compliment that I'm now in the ivory tower. I hope you're still proud of me anyway.
I'm very proud of you.
Yeah. So I'll make a remark to that. That comes from, I wrote this great big book, okay? So this is where I'm going to come from. And talk about, the great big book talked a lot about the commercialization of the internet and the first era of growth. And what hangs over us today are big unresolved questions that arose then that we didn't resolve and we're still not resolving. So in competition policy in particular, if you look at the Microsoft antitrust case, very particularly, that was a case about platform competition. That was motivated, let's say this more precisely, by platform competition and events in platform competition, and yet the result was the case itself doesn't really depend at all on your view of platform competition. It's a case about contracting restrictions and restrictions in distribution, and and talks about pricing and efficiency in the usual very conservative ways. And so one of the things you take from that, and I would say is a really big issue that still hangs in the room, is that platform competition has actually exploded since then. And it's become more complicated, and yet we're still at square one and not even introducing. It's a hard problem. I'm not saying it is easy to resolve. Even introducing the notion that we should have a variety of platforms, which is what's coming up, and what it would take to encourage that as competition policy. Let's sort of say the second thing that comes out of that, the historical perspective, is also this one event I just used to illustrate the point. In June 1995, Microsoft had a meeting with Netscape, which was the alternative platform. That meeting is, massively disputed in court, so how to interpret it. But I interviewed a lot of people. One of the things everybody walks away with from that meeting is that Microsoft had an opportunity to buy Netscape and did not come close to offering them enough money. Nobody will tell me exactly how much would have been enough. But let's take from that an interesting lesson. There was an opportunity to buy the competitor, and we got the browser wars because no deal was made. The Valley, by the way, has taken from that event the following lesson. If you are the established firm and you're facing such a situation, buy them
Before they get too big.
before they get too big.
Yeah.
And if you think it through for just a second, it was historically in everybody's interest to have had the browser wars. It introduced enormous amounts of variety. It was just the one element in the explosion of experimentation we saw in the 1990s. It wasn't the only element, of course, but it was a very key element. And so that, again, leaves us with a dilemma for which there is not a good solution. Well, if you look at the present era, there are, I think many people have noticed, not many IPOs. There are, however, no shortage of new platforms and new entry in platforms. My goodness, there's a ton of them. And yet somehow, where are those that are now going to challenge the the frightful five, I guess is what you might call, Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft. So which of those platforms of the new entrants is the competitor? And anyway, if they got big enough to be even a potential competitor, wouldn't they just be bought anyway? There's nothing illegal about that. So how to even think about that is a hard question, even though we can see that. And I'll leave it to the last comment is more a big history rather than just say the last 30 years. Let's say the last century. Microsoft antitrust, if you'll recall your history of antitrust, came from the demagogue of his era, Teddy Roosevelt, was going after the big firms of his era, and the sense of injustice that was felt, that there was too much concentration of authority and power inside Standard Oil, U.S. Steel. We can go on. First of all, let's consider ourselves lucky. We are not yet in an era, an equivalent era. In fact, we can consider ourselves lucky. When we left the last piece of growth in the late 1990s, everybody was worried about Microsoft and Intel, and now we're worried about 5 firms, and Intel's not even in that list. Gosh, that's progress. On the other hand, look at the concentration of decision-making in a small number of firms. That's the concern that originally motivated antitrust. And that concern is still there, and it's the one that's coming up repeatedly. And it is ripe for exploitation by a demagogue. And like it or not, I think we see our present era turning major policy into personalization issues. And it really concerns me a great deal that we're ripe for somebody to go very directly after the CEOs here. And if you thought what happened to Mark Zuckerberg in the last year was ugly, come on, just wait for somebody looking to score points, go after the CEOs of every one of the major frightful 5 and more. There's pretty ripe targets. And look, I know I say this partially because I know many of you in the room work for these CEOs. And I know many of them don't want to have anything to do with Twitter. They look at Elon Musk and they say, I don't want to be that guy. I'm sorry, man. It's a part of your job now. And it's actually very dangerous, sitting here as someone who's thinking about what's healthy for this country and how we determine policy. We're actually in a dangerous place. So if I'm going to give one piece of advice after saying something so dangerous, I'd say, look, the lesson from the 1990s was Bill Gates started his charity too late. Okay? And it's a very simple statement. And so if I were to say to the 5, and if you do Larry and Sergey, I guess it's 6 CEOs, start your charities now. And anything you like, commit a lot of money. I don't care how you do it. And the number one rule is if you give it to Stanford and Harvard, it isn't going to work. Okay? It's got to be something a little more.
Like Berkeley.
Oh, Berkeley. Yeah, sure, go for that. Go Bears. Yeah, I'm okay with that. I'm alumni there from there too. So that's cool.
Both Steve and Bob, I'm going to give an answer. Steve, I'm sure you have something to say about this, and I'll go to Bob.
Yeah, so one thing that I'd like to dovetail to both what Daphne said. I'm actually going to take something that exactly Daphne said because I wrote it down. When she said, what would regulating a platform for speech be like? Okay? And the reason I want to emphasize that is because right now, look at the title of our session, Platforms Under Fire. Every platform is unique in its own way, and I think there's so much confusion and muddying of the waters by keeping on the conversation of platforms.
I agree.
Right? Google is a platform with speech where the business model is advertising. I think over 80% of your revenues come from advertising. Okay? Amazon is a retailer. It also has a platform, quote unquote, because there are marketplace where it's the model is completely different. Uber has a third type of platform with a different model, with a different business model. And there's this approach of all these big tech companies, we need to regulate them because they're big tech companies. Going back to what Roger started with, these are nerds who live by the scientific method, which is relatively new. And by the way, footnote, not all these companies live by the scientific method. I spent 2 years at eBay, and eBay was a lot luckier than smart in many ways. That's something over beer. So I think first and foremost, it's critical that people start paying attention to the fact that the devil is in the details, and no two platforms are alike, and therefore no broad regulatory framework is going to work without the regulator really understanding the business model. And if at the end of the day, this is all about new technologies that are offering new ways to do the same old business models, then the regulatory environment we already have is probably the right one. It just needs to be applied smartly. And I think that's something that doesn't get enough discussion. That's all I wanted to say.
Bob.
You stole my thunder in part, and I would go even further and say they're not simply platforms. Some of them are in the widget business.
Right.
Okay, they're producing iPhones or whatever, iWatches. So you do need to look at them. I wanted to just follow up on something you said, Shane. If one sees this as a problem, that folks, as Roger pointed out, that these tech firms are in the top 5 or top 10 of the Dow or whatever, might you not want to, if they were merging or had a merger before them, might you not want to be a little bit harder on those types of firms, whatever their names are, and a little less hard on firms that are trying to get into that game? Like I was thinking about AT&T, Time Warner, without taking a position on that, but just conceptually as a policy lever if you're concerned about this issue.
Yeah, but the hard part is write that into the guidelines, right?
Yeah,
So,
I agree.
right, it has to be predictable. Otherwise, I think actually, ad hoc rules don't work very well, and that's what makes that suggestion difficult. Exactly what does that mean in a predictable way? I understand. And to follow the same logic, you wouldn't. It just doesn't make any sense to forbid merger, because there are many efficiency gains that emerge from some of the, in fact, for the vast majority of the acquisitions. And so, again, I just want to say it's not an easy problem. It's not clear how you would even think about it before you'd even write it down in a guideline. Yeah.
Daphne.
Yeah, so I will, Shane, I'll see your example of bad guys in government and raise it with a maybe worse one. And this is something also that Jack Balkin's written a fair amount about, is the idea that there are really important limits on what kind of surveillance and censorship governments can conduct. But if they can outsource it to private platforms, then those limits don't apply, right? And that sounds kind of paranoid. You have to have a real bad guy in government to be doing that on purpose.
Putin knows that one really well.
But the problem is that you get that effect without having to have bad guys in government. As long as there are congressional hearings saying there's terrorist content, we need you to fix it, the same pressure and the same government impetus and sort of threat of regulation or threat of legal consequences if you don't do something leads to platforms doing something much more than what the government ever could have mandated. And it's a dynamic that we kind of don't know what to do with and haven't thought through well enough yet.
So one request before we go to questions, or a request and then a comment. The request is, I'd love if after this conference we pivot from the frightful 5 to the delightful 5. Very helpful. And then in terms of the comment, one thing we have to keep in mind is what's the ultimate goal? Is the goal to increase the number of players that are providing these types of services to users? or is it to gain the efficiencies and the features that the users want? We really do have to kind of keep our eyes on what the ultimate goal is, because that's going to really inform the approach we take in terms of how we solve the problem.
Okay, I think it's time for us to turn to the audience. Do you see any of those? Does anybody see a question down there that they would like to answer before I call on someone? Anybody want to answer any of those? They're all quite specific.
Yeah, a lot of those have Google in it.
A lot of them are about Google.
Yeah, I can take there's one question that says, does Google see a need for national privacy regulations? And if so, what form should those regulations take? I'm assuming that means in the US, because in the US we don't have like a baseline kind of privacy legislation, but should we have that, I guess, is the question there. And I think so. I think we've seen a few instances, Cambridge Analytica is one, but we've seen a few instances where there are gaps in how people are treating the user data that they collect. And so I do think there's areas where we can apply smart legislation or regulation to try to close those gaps. But I go back to the comments I made earlier in terms of ensuring that if we take that step, that we are, one, ensuring that we're gap filling and not just starting from scratch. There are regulations and legislation on the books that address a lot of these concerns, but also that we keep the user at the forefront of this, given the dynamic nature of how we perceive privacy.
Yeah, well, I have one reaction to this comment, the panel responding to Charles Rifkin's comment.
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
Let's go for it.
Go for it.
I'm having fun being provocative. Look, I mean, he has, his firms do have, there's merit in what they say. Let's at least say the alternative. The alternative is we're not working in the patent system here, we're working in the copyright system. Yes. The copyright system gives 75, 95 years, of copyright and triple damages if you, my goodness. Right, that was if you had done a strict implementation of copyright on anybody involved in the internet system in the late 90s, it would have shut the whole thing down. Mm-hmm. Right, it would shut down all experimentation. And so there's merit in what he says, but there is merit as well in that the copyright system did not transfer to the digital era very well. And so that the compromise that was made at that time, which was to have a takedown system in compromise for not taking responsibility, that worked remarkably well in the United States. And it's not a secret that a lot of firms grew under that, and you didn't see them growing elsewhere. And it's not a secret that you can go into lots of European countries where similar kinds of behavior was shut down very quickly by the established firms who were trying to protect their copyright. So you have to, there is an alternative. The one thing I would say to him is there is also this one very clear category where everybody agrees, human trafficking. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's anybody who's going to defend human trafficking. International money laundering. I was making a list listening to him, international drug dealing and tax evasion.
Well, that's Daphne's point about some things are clearly illegal. And there's no reason to change that just because it's the internet. Yeah. I think there's a couple of other things here. The Walter Cronkite comment is sort of implicit in the question from Politico, which is essentially, wouldn't it be nice if there actually were a news media out there that was interested in covering substantive issues, such as how the internet is actually used and how extensive the problems are with respect to privacy and message media, the misinformation. It strikes me one thing that one of the costs of the current environment of polarization, which has been served by the internet, is that the genuine information content of the news has gone way down. And looking for a public sector regulatory solution to biased and incomplete information, it strikes me as looking at the wrong thing. that there's something fundamental going on in society that I do not understand. Maybe Daphne understands, I don't. Which is, why has the composition of demand for information shifted so dramatically away from actual content to a kind of infotainment that is designed to play to people's worst instinct and to let everyone seek out the daily me? Maybe you would like to comment on that.
Well, so I was saying earlier that we need a neuroscientist on the panel. I think there's a tremendous amount driven by the things we do when we only spend half a second before we click. We take shortcuts in our brain, we apply confirmation bias, we look for whatever is the most salacious or entertaining. The speed and click-driven state of the internet does seem to me like it is one important factor. But like I said, I want a neuroscientist on the panel.
Well,
to talk about that.
but there's an economic aspect of this as well as a behavioral aspect. And the economic aspect of it is the platforms are not going to be the solution to an information asymmetry problem because they're the ones who benefit from it. One of the questions was here, are we witnessing a big transfer of wealth from content to the people who what they say is tech companies, but what they really mean is some combination of people who provide pipes, and I think that's what they're actually, and maybe people who provide devices. And the answer to that is yes, but that it's not necessarily bad. All right, I mean, if most of the innovation is in the hardware and the pipes, then indeed you would expect a transfer of wealth. It's only a bad thing if the content providers are unable in some way to survive. And indeed, they were worried about that 15 years ago with Napster and the rest, but they have learned how to revise their business models in a way that they're now beneficiaries of the internet as well. So they just don't get as much as they might want, but it doesn't mean that this is a problem, a social problem. Does anybody else want to respond to any of these? Or anybody in the audience want to ask a question via the mic? And because the lights are shining on our faces, we can't see. Great. Go for it.
I'm sorry. I'm new to this. My name is Ruth Vitale, and I'm the CEO of Creative Future. We're an advocacy organization for copyright protection. But I come from the movie industry, where I made movies and distributed movies for 30 years, starting with one that you probably all know called Dirty Dancing. And so I'm new to this whole advocacy discussion between technology and film, but I will tell you a few things that I know for a fact. As recently as 2 years ago, our industry sent 900 million takedown notices to Google and YouTube alone. And that's not because we have 900 million pieces of technology, of content. It's because we put them, a pirate site goes up, we send a takedown notice, it goes down, and it goes right up the next time, okay? Respectfully, from Google, the morning of the interview, December 25th, I went online, I searched on Google, watch the IN, it auto-completed, watch the interview online free. And yes, the first block was the interview that you were selling legally, but the next 5 links were pirate sites. That's a problem for our industry, and I'm gonna tell you, I don't work at the studios, I never did, I worked in independent film. I'm gonna give you an example, and then I'll shut up, because I could do this forever. There's a movie that all of you probably know called Moonlight. It won the Oscar last year, okay? It did $65 million at the box office worldwide. But at the same time that it did that, which translates to about 9 million tickets, average ticket price is around $7, there were 60 million illegal transactions. Now, I know as well as anybody that that's not a 1-to-1 ratio that those people would have bought tickets. But let's say 5% of them had bought tickets legitimately. And not even a $7 movie ticket, but a $3.99 stream. That's $12 million to a group of independent filmmakers who worked 8 years to make that movie for no money. Now, I've testified at judiciary hearings. I get really heated up and upset. There are a lot of great minds between our businesses. And you guys need to protect. You need to help us protect the next generation of voices, be they in film, television, photography, book publishing, software, gaming, you name it. That's the cultural fabric of our planet. And yes, tech is cool, and I am hooked to my devices. But we need to think about the artistic endeavor. That's it.
I don't think this is so.
Yeah, that's a shared goal. I mean, it's bad people are going to do bad things, and when you operate at the scale that we do, it's a constant problem for us, and it's one that we invest pretty heavily in. But the goals that you articulated, those are shared goals, right? Like, we don't want people engaging in illegal activity on our platforms, and when we see it, when it's flagged for us, we take action. That's why we have those policies in place. So I appreciate that. That's a goal that we share.
I'll add. So I am so glad to be away from the copyright wars. Like, they're exhausting, and there's a lot of just entrenched positions and the same things being said, and it's hard. And one thing that I think makes it hard is another false dichotomy, the idea that there's tech on this side and there's creators on the other, and there is nothing in between.
It's a zero-sum game.
Yeah, but of course there are many things in between, right? There are creators who get their start on YouTube and wind up making a bunch of money. There are creators who are relying on fair use, and then when a filter catches their thing and takes it down, then they're out of luck. There's a continuum, and it's complicated. And there are numbers being thrown around on all sides, and it's really hard to tell whose numbers are real. I mean, one thing that I would respond to for that is, according to Google, this is after I left, but according to Google's testimony to the Copyright Office a couple years ago, of those however many DMCA notices it was, over 99% are listing URLs that aren't actually in web search in the first place. And the reason that is happening is in part because there are all these outsourced agencies who have an economic incentive to send as many notices as possible, and so they generate notices based on things that aren't actually in there. And I don't say this to, I don't want to get back in the copyright wars. Like, I would much rather work with you on ways of finding solutions. But it's hard, and the sort of uncertainty about the numbers and the value, so the things that you guys are good at, makes it a lot harder.
Yeah, but I just want to underscore the motivation. I just want to underscore the motivation, so folks aren't walking away from this thinking that the platforms are just, or Google at least, is turning a blind eye to this, and this is not something that we think very hard about, that we aggressively are pursuing and investing extremely heavily in, right? So this is it's a shared goal. The intent is not a bad intent on our part. We're not just ignoring this problem. It's a problem that we're working aggressively to address.
I'm going to declare a moratorium on the copyright wars because, as Daphne says, it's really old and the same arguments have been made for a long time. Does anybody else have a comment or question? If not,
No, over to your left.
I can't see anything. So.
Bill Ayers back there.
Bill, go for it.
So I haven't heard anybody talk about two areas where I don't think they're full solutions at all, but I just thought more could be done. One is the question about attribution, and there's a presumption of anonymity, but if the people were attributed their speech, then that would get rid of a lot of problems. And at the other end of that, if someone, like, for example, is the chief of police and he says that there's a fire in the town, everybody has to get out of the town, and a bunch of people get killed in the accident, that he can be prosecuted for that. So, you know, what could we do to get people to suffer the penalty of their false speech when it's clear that they have a responsibility and they're speaking with that role of responsibility and they're abusing it, because we created new modes for people to abuse this. And I think the InfoWars thing, for example, is close to that, although, you know, I think you get more concrete examples, because in some sense he's a channel rather than the actual person that's responsible. But I think someone who's like a senator or a president or a doctor has a different responsibility, and I think we ought to think about what we might do about that.
Does anybody have a response to Bill?
Well, I'll just quickly say, like, both of those things involve making a lot more speech illegal.
Yes.
And maybe that's okay. And definitely talking about that should be on the table. Like, I think we miss the heart of the conversation when we pretend that's not what we're talking about. And maybe there are internet-specific reasons we should be talking about that. So I'm glad that you brought them up. I know Baron has his hand up over there.
Yeah, and the attribution thing, I mean, the reason that I'm skeptical that the attribution solution has any bite is because we know who Alex Jones is. It's not that he gets away with it because we don't know who it is, right? I mean, now, there are some that we don't know who they are, but there are lots who do know who they are, and it doesn't seem to matter. So I think that Daphne's point is the crucial one, that I'm not sure we know how to make a good decision, especially in the current political environment, about how to decide which speech is allowable and which speech isn't, as long as it's not already directly illegal. Right. Or subject to litigation, liability.
So one more quick question, or you're going to miss the gondola.
All right, Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. I've spent the last 10 years avoiding copyright, the Vietnam of tech policy, so I'm not going to comment on the substance of those issues. But I will say that I've been engaged in this conference since 2008, helped organize it when PFF last organized it, and I have never heard anything so dishonest and disingenuous and cynical as the speech we just heard before this panel. That in particular failed to mention that, of course, Section 230 excludes copyright law. There is nothing in current law that fails to hold Google or any other site accountable. So to launch an attack on Section 230 as if that's the problem, as if that has anything
Baron, do you have a
whatsoever to do with copyright enforcement is blatantly dishonest.
Baron,
so I'd like to know, so my question for the panel is there any connection between the grievances of the copyright industry and Section 230 other than their opportunism?
That's a rhetorical question. Declare the panel to be done.
Okay.
Let's go.
You want to sit? Sure, go. Somebody give Neil a mic.
We're going to have an audience fight about this.
But fast.
Neil Fried with the Motion Picture Association. I just want to, Baron and I have worked together for a long time. I just want to make sure that everyone understands we talked both about in that speech, that Charlie talked in that speech about both 512 and 230. They have a common ground in that they immunize or limit liability. And his speech was about whether we need more accountability. There are very difficult issues here. We all know that. A lot of them have been highlighted here, but we're not focusing on them, right? There's a difference between the speech issues and the legal conduct issues, right? And the question we're asking is, let's not ignore clearly illegal conduct because it's going to be hard. And let's not confuse the challenges around stemming illegal conduct with stemming hateful speech, right? We're looking for that conversation. We think some way we need to get more accountability online. All of us need to do that together. And we're looking for either voluntary initiatives or a bigger conversation about the effect, not of regulation, but of liability shields and immunity, both in 512 and in 230, because they have a common philosophy behind them. That's all Charlie was saying.
So Baron and Neil are going to square up at 5 p.m. in the parking lot.
And I'll pay $7 for the ticket.
Right. But thanks very much to the panel. That was very interesting. Thank you.